This video is about maintaining a healthy sourdough starter culture so it's ready to use for baking when you are. It may seem a bit daunting at first, but it gets easy with a little experience. Really, you just need to feed your starter with flour and water once in a while, and it will love and serve you well forever. Most of what you need to know about this is already addressed in the written portion of this tutorial and in our forum. So I'm going to keep this video focused on a few things that may be better demonstrated visually. But please do read the info. It will help a lot if you're new to this. So, getting right to it, this is my sourdough starter culture that I just took out of the fridge. I like storing my starter in a clear, wide-mouth jar so I can easily see what it looks like. And with the wide mouth, I can easily add flour and water to feed it, stir it, and spoon out the starter when needed. There's not much starter here, and it's kind of dormant, and I need to bake tomorrow. So to get it game ready, I'll add about a cup of bread flour and about 2/3 cup of water. That's about equal weights of flour and water. A good ratio to give a good consistency to the starter. And let it sit at room temperature until it rises well and gets bubbly and spongy. So let's do this. I'm going to mark the level of the starter and check to see what happens to it over the course of the next few hours. Some hours later, and how much later depends on room temperature and how healthy the starter is, it's going to rise. In this case, it's been a few hours and it's more than doubled in volume. Here's the level when we fed it, and here's the level now. Awesome, right? My starter rose well, so it stands to reason that so should my bread dough. So now I'm ready to start my sourdough bread recipe, or I can put the starter back in the fridge and bake with it tomorrow or even the next day. I like to feed my starter within a day or two of baking so that it's at its peak vitality when I use it. Now here's a little tidbit to be aware of after you feed your starter. As the living yeast and microorganisms in the starter continue to feed on the flour, they will deplete the food supply, and after the starter level has risen, it will begin to fall back down on its own. This is normal. So if you feed your starter at night before bed, the starter level would rise and then could easily fall back down significantly over the course of the evening. And by morning, you might think that nothing much has happened, when in fact it did, and your starter's in good shape, having just been fed. Now earlier I mentioned starter consistency. To more easily see when your starter is doing well, you want it to be kind of stiff. It should be more like a wet, shaggy dough than a pancake batter. If your starter is thin and runny, the bubbles from fermentation will rise up through the mix and it will look like nothing is happening. But if the mix is stiff, the dough will trap the bubbles and it will rise and get spongy, and you'll know that all is right with your starter. Here's a very runny starter. It smells okay and it has lots of tiny bubbles on the surface, but I'm not totally sure how healthy it really is. If your starter is runny and you're wondering if it's dead, mix in some flour and see what happens. I'll just add some flour. No water. That'll stiffen it up a lot. Now I'll mark the level it's at now and see what happens. A few hours later, the starter is more than doubled in volume, is spongy, and looking great again. Now I recommend that beginners use white, either all-purpose or bread flour at first, just because these flours are more gluten-y and get more spongy than whole grain-based starters. So it's easier to see what's going on. If you want a whole grain starter, no problem. Just take a portion of your white starter and feed it with whatever flour you want to use. Let's do it. To make a spelt starter, for example, just take a small amount of this white flour starter and mix in some spelt flour and water. After some hours, you'll have a spelt starter, but you'll probably want to give it 1 or 2 more feedings of spelt flour to build up the quantity and so that the percentage of white flour in it will be negligible. Let's look at one more thing, when a starter goes bad. What can you do when your starter goes south because you forgot about it or were away for a long time or whatever? Starter can get pretty nasty looking after some neglect. It's not uncommon for a liquid to form on top, that's alcohol called hooch, or it can form a gray layer on top or grow any of a few colors of mold. Well, it's astonishing how resilient starter can be. I've heard plenty of stories of people reviving their starter after months of total neglect. So don't despair. Yet. Here's a whole grain starter that I've purposely neglected for a long time. It's got a really gross, moldy looking crust on the top, and it smells bad. So all I'm going to do is take a spoon and remove the top portion of the starter. Make sure I get all of that. And then take kind of a small core sample from the interior of your batch and put that in a clean jar and feed it a few times. So let's just mix in a little water, a little fresh flour. Needs a little bit more flour to get the right consistency. This is just whole wheat flour. I'm just going to feed it a few more times like this, and it can easily come back to form with no ill effects. There are other good starter care points to be aware of, like how much do you feed your starter, and how often. Again, these points and more are covered in the text accompanying this video. Also, it's very important to know that there are a wide range of starter management styles that work fine. There are no hard rules. You'll quickly learn what works for you around your baking routine. It's easy once you get the hang of it. So good luck, have fun. Now go forth and multiply your starter.